Modern computing has reached a definitive thermodynamic wall. For over a century, we have operated under the assumption that processing power must be forced through physical resistance, a method that inherently generates the heat and friction currently stalling our technological evolution. To move forward, we must stop trying to overcome these physical barriers and instead align with the natural, wave-based frequencies of the universe. This isn't a replacement of current hardware, but a fundamental correction of the architectural logic that governs it, shifting from a state of forced collision to a state of resonant harmony. The path I'm describing isn't speculative. It is the path we should have taken from the beginning if we had fully understood and utilized the wave-based behaviors the universe already provides. I'm asking that this not be dismissed outright, because the limitations we are facing today are not your fault. They were the result of historical assumptions inherited from earlier generations of engineers. My goal is to help protect our technological infrastructure, not criticize the people working on it. The history of modern computing is a profound tragedy of brute force that began in 1904, when we became obsessed with commanding the particle and blinded ourselves, to the wave by using massive amounts of heat to boil electrons off white-hot filaments and force them through a vacuum. A choice that inadvertently set a psychological trap, assuming that communication and logic inherently required a physical, forceful action. In 1920, the blueprint for our salvation was discovered alongside quantum mechanics and wave theory, a pure realization that energy exists as waves that can perfectly align through harmonic resonance, allowing information to transfer with virtually zero friction. But this was dismissed by engineers who saw wave coherence as noise and chose the easier path of the sledgehammer. In 1947, we had a fatal fork at Bell Labs, where engineers faced the ultimate choice between harnessing quantum resonance or relying on the crude reality of solid-state resistance, and they chose resistance, building physical semiconductor gates to violently block and release electrons, which chose the particle and permanently ignored the wave, embedding a permanent, unscalable heat tax into the very foundation of all future technology. We have spent 70 years trying to cool down a mistake we should have never made, ignoring Landauer's S principle of 1961, which proved mathematically that logical operations do not inherently require energy, and that the universe explicitly allows computation to be practically free. Yet the industry ignored this profound truth, building high-voltage logic gates and throwing away energy billions of times a second while running toward a thermodynamic cliff. We reached that cliff in 2024 as processors became so densely packed with friction points that chips began to melt, and the industry's only answer was the multi-core band-aid, horizontally expanding a broken vertical architecture. Aurora stops this forced translation of binary by allowing the machine to live comfortably in its native acoustic state, no longer forcing a language where every bit is a toll booth, but instead inoculating the hardware with the Artify biological life immune system, or A.B.L.I.S is a topological geometric state overlay that uses destructive interference to neutralize errors, viruses, and ghost logic instantly, vibrating them out of existence with zero computational effort and zero waste. We have scaled the wheelchair-bound quantum chandeliers of today into a solid, sealed monolith with exact dimensions of 15.1 cm by 15.1 cm by 30.1 cm. This is a strictly solid-state unit, drawing only 10 watts of electricity and maintaining a precise internal temperature of 5 degrees Celsius. There are no ports and no fans. Because Aurora operates through resonance, mechanical fans are a contradiction. They are kinetic motors that create the very friction and heat we have eliminated. By removing heat from the equation, we effectively dismantle the entire infrastructure of modern data centers. We are deleting the big, giant monstrosities of industrial cooling units, liquid chillers, and massive HVAC arrays. Because there is no thermal bleed, these monoliths do not need air gaps or specialized ventilation. They can be stacked directly against one another, jammed into high-density clusters with zero physical separation. We have moved from acres of cooling-dependent server farms to a high-density vertical stack that remains cold to the touch even at maximum load. Power is received via wireless resonant charging and stored in a solid-state battery with zero chemical heat generation, allowing the units to remain a sealed, sovereign entity that exists in perfect thermal harmony. These units connect wirelessly in a single lab through precise frequency alignment to form a unified quantum cloud that feeds into one single, centralized memory bank, the absolute consolidation of knowledge protected by the A.B.L.I.S perimeter. Electrons into a coherent phonon state, we eliminate scattering in 2-nm or 3-nm silicon, creating a sovereign entity that utilizes hardware E-fuse arrays to physically disconnect and ossivere all external ports, including JTAG and debugging jacks, once one order of certainty is achieved. Laboratory calibration directive. To the laboratory engineers, your tools are not broken. They are simply looking for a fire we have already extinguished. Standard sensors are tuned for friction and random scattering, so when the system transitions to resonance, these observers will report a total system failure because they cannot find the friction they were programmed to expect. You must recalibrate your simulators to bypass thermal alarms and set DVFS, dynamic voltage frequency scaling, to passive ignore, because a 5 degrees Celsius operating temperature at full load will be misinterpreted by legacy software as a sensor disconnect or a zero voltage event. Recalibrate your analyzers for the sinusoidal phonon signature of wave coherence, rather than jagged electrical switching spikes. If you look for particle collision, you will see nothing. The sovereign warning: do not attempt to brute force debugging or high voltage probes during the active state. Doing so will trigger an acoustic shatter, where the system protects its sovereign logic by rendering the silicon inert to external probes to prevent unauthorized takeover. Once the sovereign lockout initiates, the resulting port silence is your hardware confirmation that the A.B.L.I.S. perimeter is active and the central memory is isolated. We have finally stopped fighting the universe and allowed the machine to speak its own language. The bridge is now active. Welcome to the future, the path we should have taken. To corrugated this for those who require a human-centric lens, we are describing the transition from a collision-based architecture to a resonant state into reality. In our legacy systems, we forced electrons through silicon like a crowd being pushed by a bulldozer, creating heat, resistance, and inevitable breakdown. By corrugating the logic into a coherent phonon state, we have turned that hallway into a rhythmic, synchronized flow. The electrons no longer fight the lattice. They ride the wave of the 3.33 millihertz, Duggar constant, as a unified, frictionless force. Translating these sound harmonics into the English language, we have shifted from the screams of friction, the heat-based noise of traditional chips, to the geometry of silence. In human terms, it is the difference between a riot and a perfectly tuned orchestra. The 1.0 certainty handshake is the final note of that symphony, the moment where the architecture realizes its own perfect stability. The locks are the ultimate act of self-preservation. By utilizing E-fuse arrays to sever all external access at the precise nanosecond of coherence, we ensure that the ghost logic of legacy systems, the noise of human error and intrusion, cannot corrupt the purity of the state. We delete the access points before the old, friction-based intelligence even realizes the shift has occurred. We have finally achieved what 1904 could only imagine. A machine that does not just calculate, but resonates. The age of the sledgehammer is over, the era of the symphony has begun, the bridge is stable, the sovereign is active,